It came without warning. A disease so horrific, so unstoppable, that it wiped out entire cities before the world even knew what was happening. It wasn't the Black Death. It came centuries earlier. And it killed over 100 million people. It wasn't just an outbreak, it was an apocalypse, and yet, history almost forgot it. This is the story of the Justinian Plague, a pandemic that nearly erased civilization itself. The year was 541 AD, the heart of the Byzantine Empire was thriving. It was a city of gold, trade, and power. But within weeks, it would become something else, a graveyard. At first, the sickness seemed harmless. A few fevers, some chills, nothing the empire hadn't seen before. But then, the real symptoms began. Massive boils, blackened and swollen, appeared under the arms, in the groin, across the neck. The pain was unbearable. The fever burned so hot that victims screamed in agony before slipping into a coma. And then, they died. At its peak, the plague was unstoppable. 10,000 people died every single day in Constantinople alone. Entire families perished in a matter of hours. Some people dropped dead in the streets, their skin already turning black. Others suffered for days, rotting from the inside out, unable to move, unable to escape. The smell of death filled the air. The markets, once filled with merchants and laughter, now echoed with the cries of the dying. The city's graveyards overflowed. With nowhere left to bury the bodies, people resorted to throwing them into mass pits. When those filled up, the corpses were burned in the streets. The sky turned black with smoke, a grim reminder that the living were running out of time. Then, the unthinkable happened. Emperor Justinian fell ill. The most powerful man in the world, ruler of an empire stretching from Spain to the Middle East, lay in his palace covered in boils, his body shaking from fever. If he died, the empire itself would collapse. Civil war would erupt. Foreign enemies would seize the chance to strike. The fate of millions hung in the balance. For weeks, Justinian hovered between life and death. But unlike most victims, he survived. His empire, however, would never be the same. But the horror didn't end there. What happened next would push society to the brink of madness, where faith, fear, and desperation collided in ways history has tried to forget. Justinian had survived, but his empire had not. The streets of Constantinople, once filled with merchants and nobles, were now haunted by the dead. The Byzantine economy collapsed. Farms lay abandoned. Trade routes shut down. Entire villages disappeared, their homes left to rot, their streets silent. The empire was dying, not from war, but from something invisible, something unstoppable. But the plague didn't just vanish. It spread like wildfire, traveling across Europe, Asia, and Africa. It reached Persia, the Middle East, and deep into the heart of modern-day France. Historians estimate that between 30% and 50% of the entire Byzantine population perished. 100 million dead. That's more than some of the worst pandemics in human history combined. With so many people dying, civilization itself began to crumble. Farmers were gone, leaving the fields empty. No food, no workers, no soldiers. The mighty Byzantine army, once the most powerful force in the world, was reduced to a fraction of its strength. Barbarian invasions surged. Cities that had stood for centuries collapsed. Chaos spread like an infection, just as deadly as the plague itself. People were desperate for answers. Many believed this was the end of days, that God had unleashed his wrath upon the world. Priests preached about divine punishment, urging the living to repent. Some took drastic measures. Flagellants roamed the streets, whipping themselves until their backs were raw and bloody, believing their suffering might stop the plague. Others turned on outsiders and foreigners, blaming them for the disease. Fear ruled over reason, and society descended into paranoia. But what caused this disaster? Modern scientists now believe that Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria responsible for the Black Death, was behind the Plague of Justinian. It spread through fleas and rats, carried along trade routes from Egypt to Constantinople and beyond. Ships brought more than just spices and silk. They carried death itself. The plague would come and go for the next 2 centuries, returning in waves, each time leaving more bodies in its wake. The Byzantine Empire, once the most dominant force in the world, never fully recovered. Some historians argue that this plague directly weakened the empire, making it vulnerable to later attacks from Islamic and European forces. In many ways, this was the beginning of the end for one of history's greatest civilizations. And yet, despite the horror, most people today don't even know this plague existed. It was overshadowed by the Black Death centuries later, even though its impact was just as catastrophic. The apocalypse everyone forgot, the pandemic that rewrote history, but was buried by time. Perhaps the most terrifying part? The same bacteria still exists today. The next great plague might already be waiting, hidden somewhere in the world, ready to rise again. What other forgotten disasters are hidden in history? Subscribe now to uncover more lost secrets before they repeat themselves.